There is what should be a persuasive case against local body Maori wards. You just have to stitch some world history together. And bear with me because I'm sure you'll be persuaded, and the future of your country and family is on the line here. The left have helpfully been displaying evidence of why you should vote against Maori wards. My neighbourhood recently, we've seen these signs popping up. The narrative sounds pleasant enough at first: decide together, thrive together. But as we'll see, there is an important difference between decide together, thrive together, and decide as one, thrive as one. And that difference cuts right to the heart of why you should vote against Maori wards and resist iwi appointments to council committees. The word together implies that there are at least two authorities with decision-making power instead of one authority that represents all of us. This illustrates two very different and diametrically opposed systems of governing a country. The first system, in which multiple authorities decide together, is a system of collective rule, and the second, in which a single supreme authority decides for all of us, is a system of sovereign rule. Collective rule is a feature of Maori society. Maori tribalism involves a ruling class of many individuals who make decisions collectively, with none having the final say. In 1840, there were about 650 individuals who collectively made decisions across overlapping territorial areas within the New Zealand islands. Now, it's important to understand, deciding together isn't about two different authorities, the elected council on one side and a thing called Maori on the other. This is about the council on one side and on the other, any number of local iwi Maori individuals with decision-making authority. It's literally an unelected tribal council sitting with a democratically elected local body council. By contrast, sovereign rule is a feature of European society. A sovereign rule system involves a supreme ruler within a defined territory. In our case, the sovereign is the Crown. The Crown is the supreme ruler within the territorial borders of New Zealand. And as the supreme ruler, the Crown has the final say and decides on behalf of all of us through a system of representative democracy. So the material features of each system are collective rule in overlapping territorial jurisdictions, in the Maori context that's tribal rule, and supreme rule within defined territorial borders, which in the New Zealand context is sovereign rule. Now, before going on to critically discuss each system, there's another really important thing about these two systems of governance that I need to explain. As I said before, they're diametrically opposed. A collective authority cannot admit a sovereign authority and at the same time retain its collective authority. And a sovereign authority cannot admit a collective authority and at the same time retain its supreme authority. The two systems are mutually exclusive polar opposites. We can have one or the other, but not both. So what do we know about these two systems of rule? When the Polynesians first arrived in New Zealand around the late 13th century and right through to 1648, Europe's ruling authority was fragmented among kings, princes, dukes, city-states and the church, each claiming overlapping territorial jurisdictions. Authority was negotiated through feudal obligations and ecclesiastical law. This system of collective rule and overlapping jurisdiction was materially no different to Maori tribal governance. In this pre-Westphalia era, Europe became increasingly engulfed in war, culminating in the 30 Years' War starting in 1618. As a result of the war, the Peace of Westphalia negotiations brought over 100 diplomats together from across Europe. They spent 4 years in Munster and Onnesbroek figuring out what was going wrong. They realised that their system of overlapping collective authority did not scale well with population growth. The more decision makers, the greater the scope for disagreement, conflict and competing claims. Collective rule, they found, was bad for the economy because there was no uniform tax system and trade was disrupted by competing jurisdictions. It was bad for security because fragmented law enforcement and overlapping military obligations created chronic instability. It was bad for administration because overlapping authorities prevented coherent legal codes, courts and bureaucracy. It also hindered diplomacy and treaty enforcement as overlapping claims meant there was no reliable way to ensure compliance, and the constant power struggles fostered opportunism, corruption, and uneven enforcement of the law. The diplomats concluded that collective rule within overlapping jurisdictions was the problem, and that system of governance should be abandoned. Instead, they proposed and adopted sovereign territorial rule where each state had supreme exclusive authority within fixed borders. This marked the birth of the modern sovereign nation-state system, replacing overlapping feudal hierarchies with centralised territorial authority. In the New Zealand Islands, the Maori system of overlapping collective authority continued past the European 1648 Peace of Westphalia and remained unchanged for centuries. Each hapu had its own leaders, alliances shifted constantly, and territorial rights were never final. As in Europe, disputes were inevitable. Without a single sovereign authority to adjudicate disputes, differences were settled by force. This was sustainable while populations were small and resources abundant. But as numbers grew, the system became increasingly unstable. By the early 19th century, the introduction of muskets into intertribal conflicts led to the Musket Wars, a series of conflicts that killed tens of thousands. In the context of a population of about 100,000, this was devastating. Whole tribes were wiped out, survivors displaced, and the map of tribal control redrawn through violence. Somewhere in the number of 20% of the entire Maori population were wiped out. When the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840, the Crown had to reconcile the Maori collective system of rule with the European sovereign system of rule. The Crown sovereignty was indivisible, but the Maori concept of authority was inherently distributed and overlapping. To this day, these two systems have never been able to be reconciled in New Zealand. In the first centuries following the switch from tribal to sovereign rule, Maoris struggled to keep up with their new European neighbours. This was largely caused by the stratification of Maori society. Prior to 1840, 99.45% of the entire Maori population was in some form of servitude or slavery to the 650-odd individuals in the iwi rangatira class. In 1840, these common class Maoris were emancipated by being given the rights of British subjects in the Treaty of Waitangi. Through no fault of their own, these common class Maoris brought little to the table in the new democratic system. They had no land, no inheritance wealth, no capital to invest and no education. All the resources were controlled by their iwi, so they couldn't lend against assets to make investments and take advantage of their new British rights and the capitalist system of governance promised to them in the treaty. They had nothing to offer but their manual labour. Today, even those on the left assert that Maori poverty is driven by a lack of intergenerational wealth. Now, obviously, on that side of the fence, they always ignore the reason why. They blame colonisation instead of feudalism and pretend that the 10 billion in cash in iwi bank accounts doesn't exist. With all the right intentions, in 1975, a Labour government did the most counterproductive thing possible by creating the Waitangi Tribunal. The tribunal gives a forum for iwis to carry on their long-standing tribal tradition of intergenerational grievance harbouring and retribution seeking. The Waitangi Tribunal is one of the many archaic and deeply flawed mechanisms that holds common Maoris back in their primitive iwi tribal structure of overlapping collective rule and collective property ownership. Every step taken in the direction of overlapping collective rule by promoting the iwi tribes is a step away from supreme sovereign rule, and every step taken in the direction of overlapping collective rule is a step further back from common Maori success in a capitalist system of democratic sovereign rule. And every step taken in the direction of overlapping collective rule is a step back towards the wars that ravaged the European continent in the 17th century and the New Zealand Islands prior to 1840. If you vote for Maori wards, you are voting to move towards a system of overlapping collective rule. You are literally voting to set in place the necessary conditions, setting the stage for the future outbreak of civil war. If you vote no to Maori wards, you are voting in favour of supreme sovereign democratic rule and voting against the conditions that undeniably lead to conflict. If you vote no to Maori wards, you are voting yes to the participation of common Maoris in the democratic capitalist system, the most advanced, most civilised and most beneficial system ever known to mankind. Decide together and thrive together? No, that's a recipe for disaster. Decide as one and thrive as one. Vote no to Maori wards. Thanks for watching, give us a like would ya, and do hit subscribe to be notified of new content as it drops. See you next time.